Welcome back.
You probably already know how America was discovered, and you're likely familiar with the big moments, like the War for Independence, the Civil War, and everything that came after. But today we're diving into a part of history that most people tend to skip over. The time before independence. The early days of the colonies. How they grew, struggled, and slowly moved toward rebellion. It's a fascinating story, and not nearly as well known as it should be. So let's rewind the clock, and see how it all really began. America's story kinda kicks off in 1492, when Columbus accidentally bumped into the New World. Of course, millions of native people were already living here, with rich cultures and histories of their own. Over the next 100 years, European powers, Spain, France, the Dutch, rushed to claim land. But it was the English who really settled in, starting with Jamestown in 1607. One colony turned into 13, each with its own flavor. Puritans up north, plantations down south, and everything in between. Life wasn't exactly easy. There were harsh winters, food shortages, and conflicts with native tribes. But slowly, the colonies started to grow and thrive. By the 1700s, things were booming, but so was tension with Britain. New taxes, trade rules, and the feeling that they had no say in it all, that didn't sit well. By 1775, the pot was boiling over, and the road to revolution was just around the corner. But before we continue, I'd love for you to take a moment and let me know where you're watching from, what time it is for you, and whether you're listening to fall asleep, or just to kill time while learning some history. And if you enjoy the stories I tell, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps me make more content like this for you. It was 1492 when the old world came looking for the new. Columbus sailed west from Spain with 3 ships, and a head full of theories. He wasn't the first to dream of a passage to the Indies, but he was the one whose voyage would fracture history. And he wasn't looking for a new world. He was looking for spice routes, for wealth, for power. What he found instead was a civilization in motion. When Columbus landed in the Caribbean, he stepped into a tapestry far older than his maps. The Taino people who greeted him had no idea their world had just been pierced by a force they couldn't have imagined. Over the next decades, that force would roll like thunder across the continents. Spanish conquistadors followed, men like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, driven by dreams of gold and a divine right to conquer. The Aztec Empire, in the heart of modern-day Mexico, stood like a jewel of precision and grandeur. It fell in 1521 to Cortés and a small army, aided by steel, horses, disease, and manipulation. Montezuma, the Aztec ruler, welcomed them with diplomacy and ceremony. It didn't matter. By the time Cortés was done, Tenochtitlan was rubble. Further south, the Inca Empire met a similar fate. Pizarro's arrival in Peru spelled ruin. By the mid-1500s, 2 of the largest and most advanced civilizations in the Western Hemisphere had been reduced to colonial provinces. Their temples desecrated, their gold melted down and shipped across the Atlantic. The Spanish crown grew fat on silver and sugar, exploiting both native labor and enslaved Africans to feed an insatiable economy. The Catholic Church sent missionaries to baptize what it could not control, and European diseases swept through indigenous populations with horrifying speed. Smallpox, measles, typhus. These invisible invaders killed tens of millions. In some regions, over 90% of the native population was gone within a century. But this wasn't just conquest. It was collision. The so-called Columbian Exchange sent corn, potatoes, and tomatoes to Europe, foods that would redefine European diets, while horses, pigs, and wheat came west. Alongside them came philosophies, systems of ownership, and iron laws. The Americas became a proving ground for Europe's thirst, for wealth, empire, and dominion. By the early 1500s, other European powers began to take notice. Portugal carved out Brazil. The French turned their gaze northward to the St. Lawrence River and the fur-rich forests of Canada. The Dutch built outposts and traded with tribes along the Hudson. But it was England, late to the race, that would eventually change everything. Before we go there, though, pause for a moment with the people already here. From the vast Iroquois Confederacy in the northeast, to the Mississippian mound builders, from the Navajo and Hopi of the deserts, to the Comanche of the plains, The Americas were not empty. They were mapped in memory and myth, in clan and calendar. Trade routes spanned thousands of miles. Diplomacy and warfare shaped borders long before European ink marked any maps. These were not passive civilizations awaiting discovery. They were sovereign, spiritual, and complex. Some native groups formed alliances with the newcomers. Others resisted. Most had little choice when disease preceded diplomacy, and guns spoke louder than greetings. But resistance endured. It would endure for centuries. The scars of these first encounters, burned villages, stolen land, lost languages, are still felt, still whispered through generations. Meanwhile, Europe's appetite grew. Colonization wasn't just imperial ambition. It was seen as destiny, a divine mandate. Priests preached salvation for native souls. Merchants saw profits in sugar and silver, and monarchs measured success by how much land they could claim on maps. These maps, by the way, were often more fantasy than geography. Filled with mythical rivers, imagined cities, and blank spaces labelled terra incognita, unknown land, untold riches, all there for the taking. In 1513, Ponce de Leon landed in what is now Florida, searching at least in legend for the Fountain of Youth. He didn't find it, of course, but Spain would lay claim to much of what became the American South. St. Augustine, founded in 1565, remains the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in what is now the United States. For over a century, the Spanish held sway over the Americas, but the seeds of challenge had been planted. By the end of the 1500s, Queen Elizabeth I of England had begun to authorize privateers, essentially pirates, to raid Spanish ships. English ambitions were rising. And just off the coast of what would become North Carolina, the first English colony, Roanoke, was founded in 1585. It disappeared mysteriously within a few years. A ghost colony. A warning, perhaps, that the New World would not yield easily. Still, the hunger for empire would not be quieted. The century that followed would see the English try again, and this time they would not vanish. Their settlements would grow, prosper, and fracture. Religious dissenters would arrive seeking freedom. Crops would flourish on stolen land, and enslaved labor would be imported to build fortunes. But that's a story for another night. There is something both haunting and humbling in knowing that the world we live in today was born in these chaotic, violent, and often misunderstood beginnings. That behind every city and highway, every law and liberty, lie the echoes of conquest, resistance, and transformation. And so, the long arc of America begins, not with revolution, but with arrival. With a ship on the sea, a flag planted in foreign soil, and a clash of civilizations that would never be undone. The year 1492, when Columbus first set foot on the shores of what he believed to be the Indies, marks more than just a date in history. It is the opening chapter of an encounter that would forever reshape continents and cultures. What followed was a collision of worlds so profound that its reverberations are still felt today, in the very fabric of societies on both sides of the Atlantic. Columbus, sailing under the Spanish crown, was motivated by the intertwined desires for gold, glory, and the spread of Christianity. Yet what he, and those who followed him, unleashed was a force far beyond any single voyage or ambition. The vast lands he encountered were home to rich and diverse indigenous civilizations. The Aztecs, the Maya, the Inca, among many others. Each with complex societies, languages, and spiritual traditions. These were not empty lands waiting to be claimed. They were vibrant worlds with their own histories. Shortly after Columbus's arrival, the Spanish launched expeditions led by figures such as Hernán Cortés, whose conquest of the Aztec Empire in 1519 revealed both the ambitions and brutal methods of European colonizers. Cortés's forces, though vastly outnumbered, exploited alliances with rival indigenous groups and introduced devastating diseases like smallpox, which swept through native populations with catastrophic effects. In just a few decades, the landscape of Mesoamerica was irreversibly altered. At the same time, explorers like Juan Ponce de Leon pushed further into the Caribbean and what would become the southeastern parts of what is now the United States, always seeking new lands, riches, and opportunities to claim for Spain. The Portuguese, meanwhile, solidified their control over Brazil, weaving their own tapestry of colonial ambition. It's essential to grasp the scope of the Columbian exchange. Not merely the exchange of goods, but of ideas, plants, animals, and most tragically, diseases. Wheat and horses crossed the ocean westward, forever changing indigenous agriculture and mobility. In return, Europeans encountered maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and cacao, staples that would transform diets worldwide. Yet alongside this biological exchange came devastation. Smallpox, measles, and influenza decimated native populations who had no immunity, sometimes wiping out entire communities within years. France and England were watching these Spanish exploits with interest, motivated by their own ambitions and rivalries. The French began sending expeditions to explore the St. Lawrence River and the vast territories that would become New France, seeking furs and alliances with native peoples like the Huron. The fur trade would become a cornerstone of French colonial economics, reliant on complex networks of cooperation and negotiation with indigenous groups. The English, somewhat slower to launch their own colonizing efforts, nonetheless established Jamestown in 1607, a foothold that would grow into the Virginia colony. This venture was largely economic, centered on the extraction of resources, particularly tobacco, which soon became the lifeblood of the southern colonies. Unlike the French, the English settlers brought with them a determination to create permanent settlements, to cultivate the land, and to transplant their vision of society onto this new soil. Religious motivations also played a key role, especially in New England, where the Pilgrims arrived aboard the Mayflower in 1620. Their Mayflower Compact was a seminal moment, an early experiment in self-governance born of necessity and conviction. Religious dissenters such as the Puritans sought a new world where they could worship freely, away from the strictures of the Church of England. But in doing so, they also laid the foundations for a distinctly American culture, marked by both community and individual conscience. This patchwork of colonies, each with its own character and ambitions, was far from peaceful or united. Early relations with Native American tribes fluctuated between uneasy alliances and violent conflict. King Philip's War, in the 1770s, stands out as one of the bloodiest and most destructive conflicts of the 17th century, a brutal struggle between New England settlers and indigenous forces led by Metacom, known to the English as King Philip. It was a war born of desperation on both sides, as land, resources, and survival were contested fiercely. Meanwhile, the economic engines of the colonies depended heavily on labor, much of it forced. Indentured servitude provided a temporary workforce, but the burgeoning demand for labor-intensive crops like tobacco, sugar, and later cotton led to the expansion of African slavery. This system would grow to become a defining and tragic aspect of colonial society, deeply entangled with the economic fortunes of both the South and the northern port cities. The triangular trade routes, spanning Europe, Africa, and the Americas, facilitated the movement of enslaved people under horrific conditions. The Middle Passage was a journey marked by unimaginable suffering and death, testimonies of which survived through the words of those who endured it. Enslaved Africans were not just passive victims. They carried with them rich cultures, languages, and traditions that would deeply influence the Americas. It is worth pausing to reflect on the voices of those who suffered. Olaudah Equiano, a former slave who bought his freedom and became an abolitionist, wrote vividly of the cruelty of the Middle Passage and the moral contradictions of the colonial world. His words, and those of many others, remind us that the foundation of colonial wealth was built on profound human suffering. The legal codification of slavery, including race-based laws that would solidify the racial hierarchy, shaped a society deeply divided. Even in the northern colonies, slavery was practiced, though in different forms, weaving its presence into the very economy and culture of what would become the United States. As the 18th century dawned, the colonies had grown into complex societies with diverse origins, economies, and beliefs. Yet beneath the surface, currents of change were stirring. The Great Awakening, a powerful series of religious revivals, swept through the colonies in the 1730s and 1740s. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield challenged established churches and invited individuals to seek personal spiritual experiences. This movement not only transformed religious life, but also encouraged a questioning of traditional authority and hierarchy, an impulse that would feed into revolutionary ideas decades later. Simultaneously, Enlightenment ideas from Europe began to permeate colonial thought. The emphasis on reason, natural rights, and skepticism of absolute authority clashed with older religious orthodoxies, creating a fertile ground for new political and social ideologies. It was a time when sermons and salons might mingle with political pamphlets and newspapers, stirring debates that crossed class and regional boundaries. All these threads, exploration and conquest, cultural encounters and conflicts, economic exploitation and human suffering, religious revival and intellectual ferment, wove together to create the fabric of a new world. The Americas were no longer just distant lands on a map, but living, breathing societies, shaped by their own histories and struggles. In this vast tapestry, it becomes clearer how the seeds of revolution were planted long before the first musket fire at Lexington and Concord. The diverse peoples, economies, and ideas that had come together under colonial rule were preparing, often unknowingly, for a dramatic transformation. Sometimes I wonder, when we look back at this period, how those early voyagers and settlers could have imagined the world they were creating. The vastness of it all, the collision of cultures, the push for survival and identity, reminds us that history is never just a series of dates and facts. It is the story of people, hopes, fears, and choices that ripple through time. The English foothold in the New World was tenuous at first, but it quickly took root in ways that would shape centuries to come. Jamestown, founded in 1607 along the James River in what is now Virginia, was England's first permanent settlement. The earliest years were grueling. Harsh winters, disease, and famine took a heavy toll. Only a handful of the original 104 settlers survived the infamous starving time of 1609 to 1610. Yet, despite these brutal beginnings, Jamestown endured. The arrival of supply ships, new settlers, and the introduction of tobacco cultivation began to turn the tide. Tobacco, it turns out, was a game changer. John Rolfe's successful cultivation of a milder strain of tobacco in 1612 provided the colony with an economic lifeline. It quickly became the cash crop that secured Virginia's place on the colonial map. Tobacco plantations, however, required intensive labor, and this demand sowed the seeds of a deeply troubling system, indentured servitude at first, and then African slavery. It is striking how economics intertwined with human lives even then, setting a pattern that would haunt the colonies for centuries. Across the northern shores, a very different story was unfolding. In 1620, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, fleeing religious persecution in England. Their Mayflower Compact, signed aboard the ship before landing, was more than a simple agreement. It was a radical experiment in self-governance and community responsibility. This document laid a foundation for democratic principles, emphasizing consent and mutual obligation. It's a testament to how faith, hardship, and idealism intertwined to mold the early colonial spirit. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, established in 1630, brought a larger wave of Puritan settlers, whose vision was to create a city upon a hill, a society guided by strict religious doctrine. Religion here wasn't just a private matter, but the very fabric of public life. Churches were the center of communities, and adherence to Puritan orthodoxy was enforced with a strict hand. Yet, this religious fervor also gave rise to dissent and debate. Figures like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson challenged the rigid social order, advocating for religious freedom and separation of church and state. Their eventual banishment planted the seeds for Rhode Island, a haven of religious tolerance, one of the earliest experiments in pluralism in America. Despite these spiritual ambitions, colonial life was often far from ideal. Conflict with indigenous peoples was a persistent and tragic reality. Early cooperation sometimes gave way to violence and mistrust, as settlers expanded into native lands. King Philip's War in 1675, named after the Wampanoag leader Metacom, was one of the bloodiest conflicts between Native Americans and English settlers. The war devastated New England, leaving scars on both sides and reshaping the balance of power in the region. It is a stark reminder of the cost of colonial expansion, the complexities of cultural clashes, and the enduring consequences for indigenous communities. Meanwhile, down in the southern colonies, economic motives clearly drove settlement patterns. Unlike New England's small-scale farms, the South's warm climate and fertile soil encouraged plantation agriculture on a large scale. Tobacco, rice, and later indigo became staples, fueling the colonial economy but demanding a vast labor force. Initially, many workers were indentured servants, Europeans bound to work for a term in exchange for passage. But as the 17th century wore on, African slavery became the dominant system. The first recorded arrival of enslaved Africans in Virginia was in 1619, a fact that resonates deeply when we consider America's long and painful history with slavery. In these early colonies, society began to stratify along economic and racial lines, with wealth and land ownership concentrated in the hands of a few. Yet even as power consolidated, the colonies developed unique political institutions. The Virginia House of Burgesses, established in 1619, was the first representative legislative assembly in America, giving settlers a voice in governance and laying groundwork for future democratic practices. Such assemblies became vital in fostering a sense of local control and political identity separate from England. At the same time, the early colonies were not isolated islands. They were part of a larger Atlantic world. Trade, communication, and migration flowed across the ocean. The flow of goods, people, and ideas connected Virginia's tobacco fields, New England's shipyards, and the Caribbean sugar plantations in a complex web. This interconnectedness would deepen over the coming decades, shaping the economic and social realities of the colonies and creating dependencies that often complicated relations with the British Crown. Interactions with Native American tribes were nuanced and varied. Some colonies forged alliances through trade and diplomacy, while others descended into violent confrontation. The Powhatan Confederacy near Jamestown initially engaged in trade and occasional cooperation, but relations deteriorated over time, culminating in intermittent warfare. The narrative is rarely simple. Native American leaders employed strategies to preserve their lands and culture, navigating the challenges of European encroachment with remarkable resilience and adaptability. It's fascinating to consider how the early colonial experience combined elements of survival, economic ambition, religious zeal, and political experimentation. This mix produced communities that were remarkably diverse, even from the beginning. While the South developed a plantation economy with rigid social hierarchies, the North fostered small towns centered around church and community life, with an emphasis on education and civic participation. Each colony was carving out its own identity, yet all shared the common thread of forging new societies under difficult and often uncertain circumstances. If you pause to reflect on this early period, it becomes clear how much of what we think of as American actually took shape here. Ideas about governance, community, religious freedom, and economic opportunity, but also darker legacies of displacement and inequality. The interplay between idealism and pragmatism, between cooperation and conflict, between hope and hardship, shaped the colonial world in ways that would ripple far beyond their time. The story of these English colonies is not simply one of conquest and survival. It is a story of evolving identities. It's the slow transformation of settlers into colonists, then into distinct American communities, who would one day challenge the very empire that gave them birth. Understanding this transformation requires appreciating the texture of daily life. The harsh winters endured, the harvests gathered, the sermons preached, the alliances brokered, and the battles fought. It's in these details that the roots of revolution quietly took hold. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, these colonies grew in population and complexity. New generations born in America began to see the land not as a distant outpost but as home. They inherited a patchwork of customs, laws, and beliefs, often blending European traditions with local realities. This blend set the stage for an emerging colonial culture, distinct from England, yet still connected across the Atlantic by commerce, family, and politics. Sometimes I wonder how these early settlers felt, caught between worlds, hopeful yet uncertain, carving out existence on unfamiliar soil. Their stories remind us that history is not just grand events or famous names, but the quiet persistence of people living their lives, laying bricks for the future without knowing exactly what it would hold. The complexity of their world, the mixture of light and shadow, is what makes their story so endlessly compelling. The wind, if you listened closely, in those dense pine forests, or over the frozen rivers of the north, carried more than just the howl of wolves or the crunch of snow under boots. It whispered in French, sometimes Dutch, sometimes in a native tongue older than any map could trace. It spoke of trade, ambition, belief, and of course, competition. A quiet, creeping contest for the soul of a continent not yet called America. By the early 1600s, the French had pushed deep into the interior of North America, drawn by the promise of furs. Not gold, like the Spanish, not wide tobacco fields, like the English, but beaver pelts, soft, durable, coveted in Europe for hats and fashion. It's strange, in a way, that an animal so quiet and industrious could drive so much ambition, but furs meant money, and money meant influence. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec, perched above the mighty St. Lawrence River. It was not an aggressive conquest, but a strategic outpost, a foothold for France in a world teeming with new possibility. Unlike the English colonies, which often expanded with entire families and permanent settlements, the French presence was sparse, made up of trappers, Jesuit priests, and soldiers of the crown. They were fewer in number but far more entangled with the native world around them. Champlain formed alliances with the Huron, the Algonquin, and other tribes. These relationships weren't purely altruistic, of course. The French needed indigenous expertise to navigate the rivers and forests, to hunt, to trade, and to survive. In return, they offered firearms, metal tools, and cloth. The dynamic wasn't equal, but it was more cooperative, at least compared to the English pattern of encroachment and exclusion. It created a cultural middle ground where French missionaries learned native languages, and where indigenous communities debated conversion not under duress, but around the fire. The Jesuits especially left behind detailed records. They were meticulous chroniclers, writing of baptisms, suffering, and what they saw as spiritual warfare on the edge of civilization. One missionary, Father Jean de Brébeuf, lived among the Huron for over a decade. His writings describe the intricate rituals, dreams, and beliefs of his hosts, with a mixture of awe and condescension. In 1649, he was captured and killed during an Iroquois raid, tortured to death in a way that shocked even the hardened French. Today, he's remembered as a saint, but in truth, he was also a symbol of how deeply entangled the French were in the political rivalries of native nations. Meanwhile, further south and closer to the Atlantic, another European experiment was unfolding. In 1609, Henry Hudson, sailing under the Dutch flag, explored the river that now bears his name. His voyage laid the foundation for New Netherland, a colony that stretched along the Hudson Valley. At its heart was a wild and cosmopolitan settlement called New Amsterdam. It sat on the southern tip of an island the Lenape people knew as Mannahatta. From the start, the Dutch approached colonization with a merchant's mindset. They weren't there to save souls or to recreate a European homeland. They were there to trade, to build profit. The Dutch West India Company managed the colony like a business, not a kingdom. And for a time, that worked. They traded with the Iroquois Confederacy, exported furs back to Amsterdam, and welcomed settlers from many backgrounds. Germans, Sephardic Jews, Walloons, and Africans, both enslaved and free, lived in New Amsterdam, creating one of the most diverse early colonial societies in North America. There's a quote from a 1660s visitor who described the settlement as full of languages, full of trade, and full of confusion. That mix, chaotic as it may have been, sowed the seeds of something rare. Religious tolerance and a kind of pluralism that would survive even after the Dutch flag came down. Because in 1664, it did come down. The English, eager to control the entire Atlantic seaboard, sailed a fleet into the harbour. The Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant, famously stubborn and peg-legged, wanted to fight, but the colonists refused. They opened the gates, and just like that, New Amsterdam became New York, named for the Duke of York, the future King James II. Still, the Dutch influence didn't vanish. Their legal systems, their emphasis on property rights, and their pragmatic view of trade and society lingered. In a curious way, That legacy would later echo in the pluralistic ethos of America itself, not born of lofty idealism, but of compromise and commerce. Back in the French territories, the fur trade was pushing ever westward. Canoes sliced across the Great Lakes, through the rivers of the interior, deeper into what we now call the Midwest. Detroit, founded in 1701, meant the strait, a narrow passage of water, and also a foothold for expanding empire. The French even built forts as far south as present-day Louisiana. New Orleans, founded in 1718, wasn't a sleepy outpost, but a bustling port with Caribbean connections, African slaves, and Creole culture that blended French, Spanish, African, and Native American roots. But this expansion wasn't without consequence. Competition for furs and land created tensions with the English colonies, especially as both powers sought to ally with, and sometimes manipulate, native groups for their own strategic gain. The Iroquois Confederacy, powerful and politically astute, played both sides to maintain balance. But pressure was mounting. Lines were being drawn on maps thousands of miles away by monarchs who had never seen a North American forest. By the mid-1700s, the struggle between empires would erupt into open conflict. A war not just of muskets and forts, but of ideas and identities. The French presence, rich in its own right, would be tested and eventually diminished, its remnants absorbed into British holdings after a costly global war. But still, the marks left behind by the French and Dutch were permanent. You can hear it in the names: Detroit, Des Moines, Baton Rouge. You can feel it in the religious diversity that shaped the American psyche, and in the early tolerance of cities like New York. You can see it in the entangled legacy of European ambition and native resistance, a story neither neat nor forgotten. And in the spaces between rivers and borders, the land still remembers. The ships came first, then the sugar, then the chains. By the early 1600s, the colonies were growing, hungry for labor to feed their swelling ambitions. Tobacco fields in Virginia, rice paddies in the Carolinas, and, later, cotton plantations across the South needed hands. Many, many hands. Not the hands of English gentlemen, nor even the desperate indentured servants trickling in from debt-ridden London. No, the colonial economy turned its gaze outward, across the vast Atlantic, toward Africa. It began gradually. At first, Africans were brought over in small numbers, sometimes treated as indentured laborers themselves, working for a number of years before supposedly gaining freedom. But by the 1660s, the tone changed. The laws changed. Skin became a legal marker of status. In Virginia, a law passed in 1662 decreed that the status of a child would follow that of the mother if she was enslaved. The child would be too. It was a quiet but seismic shift. Generational slavery was no longer a byproduct of war or crime. It was becoming a racial institution. The Atlantic slave trade soon grew into one of the most brutal economic systems in human history. Ships left ports like Bristol, Liverpool, and Lisbon, carrying guns, textiles, and rum to the West African coast. There, European traders, sometimes in cooperation with African leaders, sometimes through pure force, exchanged goods for human lives. Men, women, and children were bound, branded, and packed below decks in floating prisons. The Middle Passage, as it came to be known, was a hellish journey. Some ships recorded mortality rates of 15 to 20%. Others were worse. There are diary entries from sailors, young men no older than 20, who wept at the sounds from below deck. One, in a letter home, described the stench as unbearable, like the devil's breath, and the screaming as the chorus of the damned. Some ships tossed dead, or dying, bodies into the sea to prevent disease. Sharks, it was said, followed the slave ships all the way to the Americas. They learned the route. They knew. Once in the colonies, the enslaved were sold like livestock at auctions. In places like Charleston and Newport, men stood on blocks while white bidders inspected their teeth and muscles. Families were split in seconds. Mothers from children, husbands from wives. Names were erased. Language forbidden. Those who survived the passage now had to survive a new world designed to crush them. In the southern colonies, plantation slavery became the engine of prosperity. Tobacco and rice made fortunes for men like Robert King Carter in Virginia, whose wealth rivaled that of European mobility. South Carolina's rice planters often lived in luxury, sipping imported tea while African laborers toiled knee-deep in mosquito-infested paddies. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean, even more brutal, fed northern economies through molasses and rum. But slavery was not a southern sin alone. Far from it. Northern port cities grew rich on the triangular trade. In Boston, Providence, and especially Newport, Rhode Island, shipbuilders constructed vessels designed for slaving voyages. Merchants sold rum to Africa, slaves to the Caribbean, sugar back home. It was a cycle soaked in blood and profit. Cotton would come later, but the infrastructure was already in place. Colonial banks, universities, and insurance companies often had direct or indirect ties to the trade. Even churches benefited. Some ministers, despite preaching salvation, personally owned enslaved people. There were voices of dissent too, even early on. Quakers in Pennsylvania condemned slavery as morally corrupt and spiritually dangerous. A group of German Mennonites issued the first anti-slavery petition in the colonies, as early as 1688, stating, "There is a saying that we shall do unto others as we would have them do unto us. But is this done to the Negroes?" In the early 1700s, a man named Olaudah Equiano was kidnapped as a boy in West Africa and sold into slavery. He eventually bought his freedom and later wrote a powerful memoir, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, which was published in 1789. His words pulled back the veil. When I looked around the ship, I saw a multitude of black people of every description chained together. Every object served to increase my terror. I asked if we were not to be eaten by those white men with horrible looks, red faces, and long hair. Equiano's voice, and those like him, would later become rallying cries in abolitionist circles. But for now, they were whispers drowned out by the sound of coins. In legal documents, enslaved people were property, chattel, like horses or furniture. Laws forbade teaching them to read or write. Punishments for running away were brutal. Whippings, brandings, even mutilation. Some tried to flee north. A few made it. Others rebelled, quietly or violently. The 1739 Stono Rebellion in South Carolina saw a group of armed enslaved men march south, killing whites and calling for freedom. They were eventually killed or captured. Their heads were put on spikes along the roads as a warning. And yet, the culture of the enslaved endured. Through song, prayer, and whispered stories, they preserved languages, beliefs, and hope. In the cabins and fields of the South, a new African-American culture was forming, one that blended tribal memories with the strange, oppressive world around them. The spirituals they sang carried coded messages, sometimes directions for escape. A simple-looking quilt might have held clues sewn into its patterns, a silent map for a runaway. What's remarkable, I think, is the way people can survive even when everything is built to erase them. Even in darkness, people find each other. They tell stories, they sing, they resist, in ways big and small. That spirit, buried deep in the brutal architecture of the colonial economy, would one day fuel movements far beyond what the slave owners could imagine. By the mid-1700s, millions of Africans had been shipped across the Atlantic. By 1775, nearly 1 in 5 people in the 13 colonies was enslaved. Entire generations knew no other reality. And yet, the same society that clung to ideals of liberty and personal freedom depended on their unfreedom. It's one of the great contradictions at the heart of early America, a paradox that would haunt the nation for centuries to come. The colonies were changing. Wealth was growing. Tensions, too. Soon, another force would shake the foundations. Not from across the ocean this time, but from pulpits and tents, in fire-lit sermons and trembling voices. A storm of the spirit, they called it. A kind of awakening. And it was just beginning to stir. The wind that stirred the colonial trees in the early 1700s carried more than just the scent of spring or the chill of winter. It carried questions. Questions whispered in taverns, echoed in church pews, muttered over ploughs and parchments alike. By the middle of the century, something profound was beginning to happen in the American colonies. Not in the halls of government, but in the human soul. They called it the Great Awakening, though no one quite knew, at first, what exactly they were waking from. It began not as a movement, nor even as a rebellion, but as a tremor, a shift in how ordinary men and women understood God, authority, and themselves. Let's start in Northampton, Massachusetts, a quiet town in the Connecticut River Valley. It was here, in 1734, that a local pastor named Jonathan Edwards rose to his pulpit and gave sermons so vivid they made people tremble. His words didn't merely describe the wrath of God, they made people feel it. One of his most famous sermons, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, painted a terrifying image of humanity, dangling over the fires of damnation, suspended by nothing but God's will. Yet what made Edwards truly different wasn't just fear. He also offered something profoundly personal, a relationship with the divine that didn't require the hierarchy of the Anglican Church, the rituals of the old world, or even formal education. He preached a felt religion, full of conviction and inner transformation. You didn't need to be rich or powerful to feel God move within you. That idea hit people deeply, especially in a colonial world still tied to social rank and rigid religious traditions. And suddenly, ordinary farmers, women, enslaved people, and children were crying out in churches, claiming spiritual experiences, testifying in ways that challenged the quiet formality of older congregations. And as news of Edwards' revivals spread, they stirred a hunger in others. Enter George Whitefield, a young Anglican preacher from England, with a voice said to carry across open fields to thousands. When he arrived in the colonies in 1739, it was like striking flint in a room full of dry straw. He preached outdoors, not in churches, because crowds were too large. Some say as many as 30,000 people once gathered to hear him in Boston, nearly the entire population of the city at the time. Whitefield's message was passionate, dramatic, and emotionally charged. He called on people to be born again, to find Christ, not through church attendance or moral behavior, but through personal surrender. The kingdom of God, he said, does not consist in words, but in power. Even Benjamin Franklin, who wasn't exactly a model of religious fervor, attended Whitefield's sermons out of curiosity. In his autobiography, Franklin recalled being so moved that he emptied his pockets into the collection plate, even though he had resolved not to give a cent. Now, something was happening here that went beyond theology. This was a moment where people were being told, sometimes for the first time, that they had direct access to truth, that they didn't need to wait for orders from England, religious or otherwise. And once you start questioning the spiritual authority of bishops and crown-backed clergy, it's a short step to questioning political authority too. In this way, the Great Awakening began to pull at the seams of colonial obedience. It also did something else remarkable. It gave voice to the voiceless. Black and indigenous preachers, often barred from traditional pulpits, began leading revivals in their own communities. One such figure was Samson Occam, a Mohegan who converted to Christianity and became a minister. Another was Harry Hosier, an illiterate black preacher, whose sermons captivated multiracial audiences and even moved Methodist leaders. The revival movement wasn't universally welcomed, of course. Established clergy, especially in New England, viewed it with suspicion, even contempt. They mocked the emotional outbursts, the tears, the cries, the enthusiasm of revival meetings. They feared chaos, disorder, uprising. In many ways, they were right to be afraid. Because what the Great Awakening nurtured was a spirit of personal sovereignty. The idea that each individual had the right, even the duty, to seek truth for themselves. That concept, when rooted deeply enough, doesn't stay confined to religion. It seeps into how you view every form of hierarchy: king, governor, parliament. By the 1740s and 1750s, the revivals were beginning to wane in intensity, but their imprint remained. They had inspired the creation of new colleges: Princeton, Brown, ruckers, to train ministers who embraced the new spirit. They had split churches between old lights, who clung to tradition, and new lights, who favored revival and reform. And they had introduced a culture of print, pamphlets, sermons, diaries, that connected colonists across distances, fostering a new kind of public discourse. That network, those habits, that language of awakening, all of it would be useful in the years to come, as another kind of revolution began to stir. Meanwhile, another intellectual current flowed alongside these revivals, quieter, more urbane, but just as subversive. It came not from fire and brimstone preachers, but from philosophers in London and Paris, Locke, Montesquieu, Voltaire, the Enlightenment. Colonial elites, lawyers, printers, merchants, began to devour these works. From them they learned about natural rights, the social contract, the limits of government, and they began to ask questions. What gave a king the right to rule? What rights do individuals possess simply by being human? It might sound strange, but the tavern and the pulpit were working in tandem. One inspired emotional freedom, the other intellectual liberty. Together, they made people less docile, less willing to obey simply because they were told to. Of course, not everyone was swept up in these currents. Many colonists remained loyal to Britain, comfortable in their roles, tied to tradition. But even they lived in a world that was changing. A world where newspapers spread ideas faster than governments could suppress them, where young men quoted both scripture and Locke in the same breath, and where a farm boy in Virginia might feel as empowered to speak his mind as a lord in London. The colonies were still tied to Britain, legally, economically, politically, but spiritually and intellectually, the cords were fraying. Sometimes, revolutions begin not with gunfire, but with quiet awakenings, with a tear shed during a sermon, a phrase underlined in a borrowed book, a conversation in a candlelit kitchen. By the mid-18th century, the people of the American colonies had begun to think differently, about God, about power, about themselves. And when people begin to think differently, it's only a matter of time before they begin to act. The war had officially begun years earlier, but it didn't feel like it at first. Not to the colonists, not even to many of the soldiers marching through the woods and meadows of the Ohio Valley. At first, it felt like another dispute between distant empires, with European crowns squabbling over invisible lines on unfamiliar maps. But this war, the French and Indian War, as it came to be known in the colonies, would prove to be far more than a far-off chess match. It was, in truth, the first truly global conflict, and it would change everything for the people living on American soil. It started in 1754, when a young lieutenant colonel in the Virginia militia, named George Washington, led a small expedition into the backcountry. He was only 22, untested, ambitious. Sent to challenge French presence near present-day Pittsburgh, his party clashed with French troops in a brief, chaotic skirmish. Washington's men killed the French commander, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. The French claimed it was an ambush. Washington claimed it was a misunderstanding. Either way, the fuse was lit. Within weeks, the French responded by surrounding Washington's makeshift fort, Fort Necessity, and forcing him to surrender. It was an embarrassing start, but it was enough to pull Britain and France into a wider war over territory, trade, and dominance. Not only in North America, but also in Europe, Africa, the Caribbean, and India. In Europe, the conflict would be called the 7 Years' War. But here, in the American colonies, it was more personal. Here, it was about survival. It was about who would control the rivers and the forests. Who would claim the allegiance of native tribes? Who would write the next chapter of the New World? Native American tribes were not passive bystanders. Far from it. They were powerful players, making careful, strategic choices. The Iroquois Confederacy attempted to walk a fine line of neutrality, but others took sides. The Huron and Algonquin sided with the French, their longtime trading partners. Tribes like the Catawba and Cherokee leaned toward the British, at least at first, drawn by promises of weapons and protection. Yet no alliance was simple. Each tribe had its own interests, its own memories of betrayal, its own hopes for survival. And the war itself was brutal. This was not the kind of conflict fought by gentlemen, empowered Whigs on tidy European fields. It was ambushes in the dark, villages set aflame, scalps taken, captives marched through freezing forests. Both European powers used native allies to raid enemy settlements, and the line between soldier and civilian often disappeared. Homes were burned, crops destroyed, entire communities uprooted. One colonial settler described the terror of those years in a letter to his brother. "We know not who our enemy is. We go to sleep at night, wondering if the trees will move, if the shadows will come alive." There was a constant fear, especially in the frontier settlements, that death was just beyond the tree line. Still, there were moments that echoed with future consequence. In 1755, the British general Edward Braddock led an expedition to capture Fort Duquesne, near where Pittsburgh now stands. Washington, still young but learning quickly, served as his aide-de-camp. The expedition was a disaster. Braddock, trained in the European style of warfare, marched his redcoats in columns through the thick American forest, as if the woods were a ballroom. The French and their native allies ambushed them, firing from behind trees and rocks. Braddock was shot and later died. The British lost over 900 men. Washington emerged unscathed, and though he wasn't yet a hero, the legend began. He wrote of the chaos and confusion, the way the British troops broke ranks, panicked. "The bullets flew like hail," he recalled, "and 2 horses were shot from under him. 4 bullets pierced his coat, but none touched his skin." It was one of those strange, almost mythical details that would follow him for life. The war dragged on, changing shape with each passing year. Britain, initially overwhelmed, began to shift the tide under the leadership of Prime Minister William Pitt. He poured money and men into the North American theatre. Naval power was used to cut off French supplies. British soldiers, alongside colonial militias, began seizing French forts one by one. By 1759, the decisive blow came in Quebec. British General James Wolfe led a daring assault up a steep cliff under cover of darkness. The French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, rushed to meet him on the Plains of Abraham. Both men died in the battle, but the British won. The fall of Quebec sealed France's fate. 4 years later, the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763. France ceded Canada and all lands east of the Mississippi to Britain. Spain, who had joined the war on France's side, lost Florida. In one stroke, the French Empire in mainland North America was finished. But for the British, victory came at a price. The war had cost an enormous amount, over £130 million, a staggering sum. Britain now had vast new territories to govern and protect, especially in the West, where settlers were already eyeing lands in the Ohio Valley. But the native tribes who had supported the French were not simply going to welcome British settlers. In fact, they were enraged. In 1763, a coalition of tribes, led by the Ottawa leader Pontiac, launched a violent uprising against British forts and settlements. Known as Pontiac's Rebellion, it was a grim reminder that conquest did not mean peace. Dozens of forts were attacked, hundreds of settlers killed or captured. The British response was brutal, including the infamous suggestion, recorded in letters, to distribute smallpox-infected blankets among the tribes. That same year, the British Crown issued the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. It was meant to calm tensions with native tribes, but instead it infuriated the colonists, many of whom had fought in the war and felt entitled to the spoils. The line was seen not as a protection, but as a betrayal. And so the seeds were sown. Britain had saved its colonies, but at the cost of goodwill and financial stability. In the years to come, Parliament would look to the colonies to help shoulder the war debt, through taxes and regulations that would ignite resistance. But something even deeper had shifted. Colonial militias had fought and died for land they would now be denied. Colonists had seen the incompetence of British generals. They had watched leaders like Washington rise, while redcoats floundered in unfamiliar forests. They had tasted the possibility, however faint, of self-reliance. Looking back, It's hard not to feel the tension tightening with each year. The war had redrawn maps, rewritten alliances, and redoubled the empire. But in the shadows, something else was growing. A sense that maybe the empire needed them less than they had once believed. And perhaps, in time, they would need the empire even less. Because once the smoke of war clears, what remains is not only the cost, but the questions. And those questions, quietly asked in taverns, in puppets, and in printed pages, were beginning to echo louder. The first flames of anger were no longer flickers. After the French and Indian War ended in 1763, the American colonies were shifting. Tensions thickened like storm clouds rolling in from the Atlantic. The war had left Britain deeply in debt, and the empire now looked to its North American colonies to help shoulder the cost. But the colonies, so long used to a degree of autonomy, bristled at the notion of paying for a war they hadn't started, and whose spoils often felt like they benefited the crown far more than the common colonist. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act, a law aimed at curbing the smuggling of sugar and molasses by reducing the duty but enforcing it more rigorously. It may have seemed a small thing from London's perspective, but to Boston merchants and New York traders, it was an ominous precedent. The law wasn't just about money, it was about control. And worse, it was followed swiftly by the Stamp Act of 1765, which required colonists to buy special stamped paper for legal documents, newspapers, even playing cards. That was the real ignition point. It wasn't the cost of the stamp itself, not really. It was what it represented. For the first time, Parliament was directly taxing the colonists without any say from colonial legislatures. No taxation without representation, they cried. Not as a slogan yet, but as a deep, instinctive resistance to being ruled from afar by people who had never set foot in Virginia or Massachusetts. You could feel the ground shift then. Across taverns and town squares, whispers turned into speeches, and speeches into protests. In Boston, a group of radicals formed what would become the Sons of Liberty, a name whispered with admiration by some and fear by others. They weren't just agitators. They were craftsmen, printers, brewers, ordinary people who found themselves at the heart of a growing resistance. In August 1765, they hanged an effigy of Andrew Oliver, the official in charge of enforcing the Stamp Act in Massachusetts, from a tree on Boston Common. Later that night, a mob destroyed his office and ransacked his home. Oliver resigned the next day. Similar scenes played out in other colonies. Across the 13, the stamped paper was burned, boycotted, or never sold at all. That resistance worked. The Stamp Act was repealed in 1766. Parliament backed down, but not entirely. They passed the Declaratory Act the same day, stating that they had the right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. A quiet warning. Then came the Townshend Acts of 1767, named after Chancellor Charles Townshend. These imposed duties on imported glass, lead, paints, paper, and tea. Britain argued that these were external taxes, unlike the internal nature of the Stamp Act, and therefore acceptable. But colonists saw no such difference. They responded with boycotts, refusing to buy British goods, spinning their own cloth, drinking herbal Liberty tea instead of British imports. Women, in particular, stepped into political life in new ways, organising spinning bees and refusing to buy imported luxuries. The resistance was becoming domestic, communal. Things escalated. British troops were stationed in Boston in 1768 to keep order. They were young, underpaid, and often idle. Tensions simmered between them and the locals until March 5, 1770, when it boiled over. That night, a crowd of colonists began heckling a British sentry outside the customs house. Snowballs flew, some with rocks inside. More soldiers arrived. Amid the chaos and shouting, someone yelled, "Fire!" And they did. 5 colonists were killed, including a black sailor named Crispus Attucks, often considered the first martyr of the American Revolution. It became known as the Boston Massacre, though British defenders called it a tragic accident. The scene, immortalized in a dramatic engraving by Paul Revere, spread like wildfire through the colonies. It didn't matter that John Adams, yes, the future president, actually defended the British soldiers in court and got most of them acquitted. What mattered was the symbol. Blood had been spilled in the streets of Boston, not by foreign invaders, but by British redcoats. The line between colony and mother country was blurring into something darker. For a few years, things quieted. Parliament repealed most of the townshend duties, except the one on tea, left in place as a reminder of British authority. But that single duty would come to matter far more than anyone expected. In 1773, the British East India Company, drowning in unsold tea and financial trouble, was granted a monopoly to sell directly to the colonies through the Tea Act. It actually made tea cheaper, but again, it wasn't about the cost. It was about principle. Colonists saw it as a trick to get them to accept the idea of parliamentary taxation. They refused the shipments in several ports. In Boston, things would go much further. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of men, some dressed as Mohawk warriors, boarded 3 British ships in Boston Harbor. They worked in eerie silence, opening 342 chests and dumping over 90,000 pounds of tea into the black water. No one was hurt. Nothing was stolen. It was deliberate, theatrical, and unforgettable. The Boston Tea Party wasn't just an act of defiance. It was a public declaration that compromise might no longer be possible. London responded with fury. The coercive acts, called the Intolerable Acts in the colonies, shut down Boston's port, revoked Massachusetts' charter, and allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England. It was collective punishment, and it only deepened colonial unity. From Virginia to Pennsylvania, colonies sent food and supplies to Boston. Sympathy became solidarity. And in September 1774, a group of delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia as the First Continental Congress. They weren't calling for independence, not yet, but they were speaking with one voice. They called for a boycott of British goods and began preparing local militias, just in case. What strikes me when I think about these years is how fast things changed. In the space of a decade, a scattered set of colonies with different economies, different cultures, and even different languages had begun to act like a nation. Not because they planned it, but because the pressures of empire had pushed them together. And maybe that's how revolutions often begin. Not with one sudden spark, but with a slow accumulation of injustice and courage. With people who one day realize they've had enough. The road ahead was narrow and steep, but it was now unmistakable. And then came the spring of 1775. British troops on the march, riders on horseback in the dead of night, muskets loaded in barns and churches, the sound of footsteps on Lexington Green. The fire was about to catch. Let's keep going. It was in the quiet tension of the early 1770s that the colonies began to change, not just politically or economically, but emotionally. The unrest was no longer confined to the pens of pamphleteers or the shouts of protest in city squares. It was settling into the homes and hearts of ordinary people. Farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, ministers, even housewives, all began to sense that they were living through something far greater than another dispute over taxes. A shared feeling emerged, unspoken yet deeply understood. Something irreversible was unfolding. This shift didn't come overnight. It crept in through whispers at town meetings, through fiery sermons in country churches, and through the ink of newspapers that now dared to question not just British Parliament, but monarchy itself. The First Continental Congress had met in Philadelphia in 1774, a gathering of men who had not yet declared themselves rebels, but who no longer believed they were mere subjects. There was a sense of deliberation in that meeting, a hesitancy that many forget today. These weren't revolutionaries from the outset. Most of them still hoped for reconciliation. What they truly wanted was recognition of their rights, their autonomy, and their dignity as Englishmen. But they also knew, perhaps deep down, that the door to peaceful negotiation was slowly closing. The Congress didn't yet call for independence, but it did call for unity. And unity, in a continent as diverse and scattered as colonial America, was a revolutionary act in itself. Delegates came from as far north as Massachusetts and as far south as Georgia. They didn't speak in a single voice. They clashed, debated, postured, but they came together. That mattered. They agreed on a boycott of British goods, And more importantly, they formed the Continental Association, a pact that would begin to weave the scattered colonial economies into something like a single organism. Outside the halls of Congress, the streets were alive with conversations sparked by writers like Thomas Paine. His pamphlet Common Sense, published in early 1776, but preceded by other incendiary essays, would electrify the colonies. Paine wrote not in the cold, abstract prose of the elites, but in a voice that anyone could understand. His argument was simple. Monarchy was not just flawed, it was unnatural. And independence was not just possible, it was inevitable. But even before Common Sense, the printing press had become a weapon. Dozens of colonial newspapers, from Boston to Charleston, were printing essays, sermons, editorials, and letters to the editor that stoked debate and invited dissent. The colonies had more printers per capita than anywhere else in the world at the time. It's easy to forget, in our age of digital noise, just how powerful a printed page could be when information was scarce. A single newspaper article could travel from village to village, passed from hand to hand, read aloud in taverns and churches. And it wasn't just the elites who were reading. Literacy was unusually high in the colonies, particularly in New England. Boys and girls alike were taught to read, often for the purpose of reading the Bible, but that skill spilled over into political life. Public discourse became just that, public. People gathered to talk about parliament, about rights, about liberty. The language of revolution became part of the air they breathed. There was also, in this moment, a growing unease in the countryside. Powder alarms, false reports that the British were coming to seize weapons, began to spread like wildfire. In 1774, one such alarm in Massachusetts mobilized tens of thousands of militiamen in a matter of hours. They arrived only to find no British troops, but the response revealed just how ready the colonies were to defend themselves. They had formed committees of safety, created covert stockpiles of arms, and begun drilling regularly. These weren't formal armies. These were farmers with muskets, mechanics with clubs, teenagers with powder horns. Some of them had fought in the French and Indian War. They knew how to shoot, how to track, how to survive in the wild. Others had never seen combat, but carried a growing sense that they might have to, soon. The British, meanwhile, began to see this militia movement as dangerous and illegal. What the colonists called a community defense force, the Crown now called a rebellion. And so we begin to see the birth of something fragile and fiery, the identity of the patriot. It wasn't a formal title. No one bestowed it. It was worn like a quiet badge, worn in silence by the man who buried a chest of powder in his orchard, or by the woman who passed coded messages sewn into quilt patterns, or by the printer who refused to stop his press despite threats from the loyalist mob. But it's important not to paint this as unanimous. The colonies were still divided. Many remained loyal to the Crown, not out of cowardice, but because they genuinely believed revolution would bring ruin. There were arguments at dinner tables, in town halls, even in churches. Brother against brother, friend against friend. There was fear, real fear, of civil war. And yet the tide was turning. Across the 13 colonies, there was a slow but steady shift toward a shared dream that perhaps, for the first time, they were not merely outposts of an empire, but something else. Something embryonic. A people, maybe. Not yet a nation, but the beginnings of one. I think about those people often, not the names in textbooks, but the ones we don't know. The quiet radicals who gathered by candlelight, reading printed words that set their minds on fire. The older generation who wrestled with change, and the younger who embraced it with reckless hope. I wonder how many of them understood the scale of what they were building, or whether they were simply swept along by forces larger than themselves. By the end of 1774 and into 1775, those forces were no longer distant. British troops patrolled the streets of Boston. Colonial militias drilled in frozen fields. The smell of gunpowder and ink hung in the air. And though few would say it out loud, the path was becoming clear. There was no turning back. The match was lit. And not long after, the fire would come. The air was still before dawn, on April 19th, 1775. A light fog hung low across the roads stretching out from Boston, dew collecting on the blades of grass beside them. In the small town of Lexington, men waited with muskets in their arms and uncertainty in their hearts. They had been warned. The regulars are coming. And now that whisper had turned into the sound of boots, methodical and steady, marching down a dirt road still wrapped in darkness. This was not a grand army. On either side, there was no expectation of glory. But that morning, a line was crossed, quietly, then with a crack. A gunshot, still debated to this day. Who fired first? We may never know. What we do know is that within moments, British soldiers and American militiamen were exchanging fire. 8 colonists lay dead in the grass of Lexington. The British pressed on toward Concord. There, at the North Bridge, the militia pushed back. Redcoats were forced to retreat, and the countryside ignited. That day, farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, ordinary men with no formal training, chased the might of the British Empire down miles of winding road. From behind trees and stone walls, they fired, vanished, and reappeared again. It was a kind of warfare unfamiliar to the British officers used to open field battles and formal volleys. The colonists fought like men defending their homes, not just soldiers obeying orders. By nightfall, 73 British soldiers were dead, and nearly 200 more were wounded or missing. The colonial casualties were lighter, but the emotional toll was heavy. This was no longer about taxes or trade. Blood had been spilled on both sides. What had once been protest had become war. News travelled fast. Within days, word of the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord had spread from Massachusetts to Virginia, carried on horseback, printed in broadsheets, whispered in taverns. In Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress was already preparing to meet. And now, the question wasn't whether to resist British policy. It was whether to prepare for full-scale rebellion. On May 10th, 1775, just 3 weeks after the shots at Lexington, the Congress reconvened. And this time, they were different. More unified, more resolute. John Hancock took over as president of the Congress. George Washington, still a quiet Virginian landowner, but with military experience from the French and Indian War, was selected to lead the new Continental Army. He accepted in a modest suit of blue and buff, his demeanor grave. He understood what it meant. Once you raise an army against your king, there's no walking back. Meanwhile, rebel forces in Vermont, led by a wiry, stubborn man named Ethan Allen, and accompanied by Benedict Arnold, seized Fort Ticonderoga from the British, gaining precious artillery. It wasn't just a symbolic win. Those cannons would later be hauled over snow-covered mountains to Boston, a feat of endurance that changed the tide. Still, not everyone wanted war. Some hoped for reconciliation. The Congress sent what became known as the Olive Branch Petition to King George III, pleading for peace, affirming loyalty to the crown, and asking for grievances to be addressed. But the king refused to read it. Instead, he declared the colonies to be an open rebellion and vowed to crush them. That rejection shattered any illusions of compromise. It was as though a door had closed. Behind it stood centuries of British tradition, of royal authority and imperial rule. But outside it, a new door creaked open. Something unknown, dangerous, but deeply stirring. Across the colonies, people began to choose, not just whether to fight, but who they were. Loyalist or patriot, British subject or American citizen. The divide tore through families, neighborhoods, churches. Some, like Benjamin Franklin, were pulled in opposite directions by their own kin. Franklin's son, William, was a staunch loyalist. Their relationship never recovered. The early months of 1775 and 1776 were marked by tension, by organizing and armament, but also by deep internal reflection. What did it mean to be free, to govern oneself? These weren't just philosophical questions. They played out in the actions of thousands. Women like Abigail Adams wrote letters urging that liberty should be extended to all. Enslaved people looked toward the rhetoric of freedom and asked if it applied to them. And Native American tribes watched nervously, knowing that no matter who won, their lands and sovereignty were in danger. By the time winter settled in, the siege of Boston was underway. Colonial troops had surrounded the city, containing the British inside. Supplies were short, morale dipped. But on March 17, 1776, after months of standoff, the British finally evacuated the city. They sailed to Halifax, leaving Boston in rebel hands. That moment, quiet, almost anticlimactic, was a triumph. Washington had won his first major strategic victory. It's remarkable to look back and realize how fragile it all was, how often it could have fallen apart. The colonies were not united by language, religion, or industry. They were stitched together by a common frustration, a growing sense that their destinies should no longer be written from across an ocean. In just under 3 centuries, they had gone from unknown outposts to a powder keg of revolutionary thought and action. And here we are, at the edge of that transformation. 1775 marked the spark, but the fire would rage on for years. It would consume cities, change alliances, and forge a new nation from the embers. But that's another story. As we end this long, winding journey through the hidden history of America before independence, I'm reminded of how history often whispers before it shouts. These centuries weren't just a prologue, they were a crucible. The revolution wasn't born in a single moment. It grew in the soil of Jamestown, in the prayers of Puritan meeting houses, in the cries of enslaved people in Charleston, and in the minds of philosophers in Philadelphia. Thank you for spending this time with me, walking slowly through the past. If you enjoyed this quiet journey into America's deeper roots, I hope you'll consider liking this story and subscribing to the channel. That way we can meet again on another night, with another mystery, another piece of forgotten time. Until then, rest well, wherever you are, and good night.